Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Morning. I'm Dan Runde. I'm a Senior Vice President and hold a Schreier Chair in Global Analysis here at CSIS. I want to welcome everyone who has joined us for this webinar on Usaid and the Indo-Pacific strategy, COVID-19 disruptions and next steps. I'm very grateful to our partnership with AID to make this happen. While the Indo-Pacific strategy articulates a sound foreign policy in the region, COVID-19 has prompted a need to adapt the way Usaid approaches each of the strategy's three pillars: governance, economics, and security. This webinar will bring together experts from government, NGOs, and the private sector to analyze how Usaid can fine-tune its development approach to accomplish the broad objectives of a free and open Indo-Pacific. I'm really grateful to host Gloria Steele from Usaid, Tom Carothers from the Carnegie Endowment, Glenn Prickett from the World Environment Center, and Peter Raymond, who's a senior associate here at CSIS, but has many years of experience in the global infrastructure world and is someone we turn to all the time for this discussion. Gloria will make a few remarks before we begin our moderated conversation amongst the group. Gloria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Good morning and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Dan, and your team for working with us, my team led by Lynn Liu, in putting this together. As I have repeatedly said in all the sessions, we are going to use your wisdom, the views that you share with us to help inform the country's strategies that we are in the process of developing. And so I really thank you for all of that. We know that things have changed. And while we have put together a strategic framework under the Indo-Pacific strategy over the last year, we are seeking for ways to be able to pivot and find ways that we can help our partner countries to be able to deal with the impacts. Our Indo-Pacific strategy's implementation has three objectives. The first being strengthening democratic institutions. The second being the improvement of management of natural resources. And of course, the third being fostering private sector-led growth. Over the last month, since August, we have been discussing these issues with you. And I would like to thank Glenn, Tom, and Peter for joining us again as we pull this all together. This is going to be the final meeting of the 4 meetings that Dan has agreed to put together for us. And so I really look forward to hearing from all of you as we pull all these things together and how they intersect and how one affects the other. So again, I look forward to your presentations and having a discussion with you through the morning. Thank you so much. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Gloria. We've agreed to publish 3 papers, one on each of the pillars. We have one that's already out in the public domain. We have another coming out in about a week's time, and then a third in several more weeks on each of these. So just watch this space, and we'll be sending them out broadly, in addition to sharing them broadly within Usaid and USG stakeholders. So Tom Carothers, let me turn to you, because Gloria, you and I are going to co-moderate this together. So let me take a stab at a first question to Tom, and then maybe you might ask a question of Tom as well. So Tom, while the Indo-Pacific's established democracies are showing resilience, COVID-19 has caused its newest and weakest democracies to experience a regression in civil liberties and political rights, particularly from rising trends of autocracy, disinformation, political coercion, human rights violations, and corruption. That's a heck of a list. How has COVID-19 created greater opportunities, I'll put that in quotes, for authoritarianism, terrorism, corruption, and Chinese interference? That's a big question, Tom, but over to you.
Well, thank you, Dan and Gloria. It's great to be here. First, I'd like to commend Usaid for making democratic governance an integral part of the Indo-Pacific strategy and engagement in that. Too often we talk about geostrategy as somehow being separate from democracy or even cutting against it, whereas in fact, it's best to see it as integrated. Let me just say a few words about the effect of the pandemic on democracy in the region, Dan. First of all, we have to note that the pandemic is hitting democracies in the region much harder than non-democracies. Think of Indonesia, the Philippines, and India, for example, compared to, say, Thailand, Vietnam, even Cambodia and Laos. Now, that's not because they're democracies on the one hand and not democracies on the other. It has more to do with state capacity and plain old luck and leadership and some other things, but it is nevertheless a fact. Now, unfortunately, there's quite a menu of the ways in which the pandemic is negatively affecting democracy in the region. Let me just go through it really quickly, but it's important to highlight these points to give us a structure for our thinking. First, governments are taking advantage of the pandemic to, in a sense, increase their executive power, restrict liberties. I don't need to give details on that, it's well known, but it's a big tendency. Second, delayed or canceled elections. We have a number of elections in the region that have been delayed or canceled, and this is traumatic to a democracy. Imagine in the United States, if we delayed our election 6 to 12 months, that would upset a lot of people. Third, surveillance. The pandemic in both non-democracies and democracies is opening up the door to new surveillance technologies, which can be very useful in a public emergency, but can be very dangerous to inculcate into a system and hard to get rid of later if you're trying to put limits on it. Fourth, polarization. You know, we always hope in polarized societies, Dan, that, you know, the Martians arrive on Earth and finally we agree to stop being polarized and fight the Martians. Well, the Martians have arrived in the form of the pandemic, and unfortunately, polarized societies are not coming together. Again, think of our own country. We're fighting over how to fight it rather than fighting together. And that's really destructive of democracy. And we have a number of very polarized democracies in the region. India is very polarized. Indonesia is becoming so. Bangladesh has been. Thailand is, and so forth. We just did a report at Carnegie on polarization in South and Southeast Asia, which I'd encourage you to look at. So the pandemic is increasing polarization rather than decreasing it. Fifth, anti-corruption. Unfortunately, the pandemic is a corruption extravaganza. It presents tremendous opportunities for people to take advantage for smuggling, for fraud, for governmental corruption around aid flows, unfortunately, or for governmental packages that become corrupted. And so pandemics, as we've seen in past pandemics in Africa and elsewhere, present tremendous opportunities for fraud and for governmental corruption generally. And finally, militarization. Militarization of pandemic responses, giving military forces a bit more of a role than they really should have, appointing military people to be in charge of pandemic responses, giving security forces a role in enforcing public health measures, and so forth. So you put that together, it's quite a stew of factors that are pushing on democracy in the region. Add to that one more, I don't mean to overwhelm things here, but one more is economic crisis. On top of all these facts that sort of arise from the public health emergency, we have an unfolding economic crisis. And if we say in simple terms, what was the political effect of the global economic crisis of 2008 and 9 over the subsequent 10 years? It wasn't good. Those were the 10 years in which democracy moved into retreat in the world in many ways. So why? Unhappy citizens in democracies hit with economic crisis become vulnerable to demagogues. They become vulnerable to extra systemic people who promise the moon and sort of say they have the answers. It increases social tensions, increases inequality, increases protests, instability, and so forth. So it isn't just 6 to 12 month picture here of effects on democracy. It's a much bigger story. Now I could turn to sort of what are some of the ways US might address that, or I don't know if you'd rather go there.
Well, Gloria, what do you think? I just think Tom's one of the greatest minds of his age on the democracy work. I read all of his books. I'd love to hear from him about this if you didn't have an objection, Gloria.
Absolutely. No, please go ahead.
Let me also just mention China. I didn't want to overload the pony here, but 3 things to say about China. First, this hasn't really been emphasized as much as I think it would in global discourse, but unfortunately, China is doing the best economically of all the major economic powers coming out of the pandemic. It's having the fastest recovery. And actually, the Chinese economy is gaining on the rest of the world in relative terms, even though the Chinese economy is greatly slowed, less so than the rest of the world. So first, China is gaining economic wherewithal compared to its rivals. Secondly, it's selling its model of authoritarian control over the pandemic. It's not an entirely honest model, and there are a lot of problems with it, but it's selling in some places because it seems persuasive to some people. And third, China has helped to offer in terms of medical supplies, technical expertise, and it's doing that. So the pandemic is not only hitting democracy hard, it's opening the door to China in several different ways at once. Now, of course, I don't have any magic bullets for USAID, but I just emphasize four things that are certainly worth thinking about. We're narrowing down to a DG agenda here. The first is we've got to really emphasize anti-corruption assistance. At this time, we have to really focus both on encouraging governments to set up new anti-corruption measures to monitor pandemic responses, to monitor new assistance flows and new economic flows. We have to help those civic groups that are monitoring, watchdogs, investigative journalists. This is the time to step up our anti-corruption agenda to the maximum. Second, elections aid. Election commissions, domestic observers, they need extra help now. This is very, very hard. Our country, a very wealthy country, a long history of democracy, is struggling to hold an election in a pandemic. Imagine if you're Indonesia or India or Myanmar or other countries with much weaker capacity in this area. It's very hard to hold an election in a pandemic. They need help. They need greater forms of election assistance at this moment. Third, depolarization. There's no magic for depolarizing a polarized society, but USAID and others have carried out civic dialogues and political dialogues that really need stepping up at this time. There needs to be more space for people to come together to discuss and get over polarized sort of anger and create neutral spaces for discussion. And fourth, civil society bolstering. If there's a silver lining politically in what's happening with the pandemic, it's civil society. Civil society is stepping up in many countries. Civic activists are out there on the front lines. They're showing their utility to everyday citizens. They're repurposing work that they've done in other areas to bring their grassroots organizing skills, their commitment, and their passion to the problem at hand. They need help. Aid flows are reducing. Domestic sources of funds are being reduced in many cases. They need extra help now. So this is a time to build civil society into emergency aid responses, insist that governments have part of the pie dedicated to civil society that they're getting in emergency relief, and increasing just basic civil society support to help a rights group that moves over to COVID work and so forth. So anti-corruption, elections, depolarization, and civil society support are four things that I would start with, Dan.
This is fabulous. Gloria, if you don't mind, what I suggest we do is we pivot to Glenn and then we come back. I know you'll have questions too if you don't have an objection.
Right, and some of my questions are really intersecting, so let's proceed with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Glenn, COVID-19 is a wake-up call to the importance of proper natural resource management. However, reports are increasingly common that the opposite is occurring as countries and communities react to the virus. Industries related to tourism, food, and agriculture have been significantly impacted by COVID-19 due to lockdowns, social distancing measures, and travel and trade disruptions. There's also the challenge of, I think there's going to be a lot more attention on the environment health nexus because of COVID. And that was something we talked about in our session. And there's going to be increased attention on fisheries, not just because of overfishing, because it's an environmentally important issue and because I like eating fish on a regular basis, but because I think there's a great power competition overlay. So Glenn, what are the most significant natural resource vulnerabilities resulting from COVID-19, and how can development partners, including USAID, elevate international standards to respond optimally to these challenges in the great power competition context?
Well, Dan, thank you first for doing this, for putting this panel together, for leading this research effort. The paper you've done on natural resources management is excellent. I hope everyone watching will read it as soon as you get it. There's a lot there, particularly new reporting that's hard to get now that we're all locked down, not able to travel. The media isn't covering these issues as much as we would like. So, kudos to you. So yeah, I guess the most important point I want to make is that the COVID-19 pandemic is having impacts, and your paper lays those out well. But that's on top of a pre-existing ecological condition in the region. So the seas, the forests, the wetlands of the Indo-Pacific region were already threatened with degradation from human activity. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services issued a report looking at the status of natural resources around the world. They determined that 75% of the terrestrial natural habitat of the world had already been altered by human activity, which put more than 1 million species of plants and animals at risk. So the red lights were already flashing on the dashboard. Poorest people around the world, including in the Indo-Pacific region, will be the most affected by this because they depend the most on natural systems for their lives and livelihoods and shelter and safety. And we here in the United States are vulnerable to these impacts indirectly. We're experiencing already the effects of runaway climate change with the tremendous fires in the West and storms and flooding in the East. And what science tells us is that effectively managing natural resources around the world is critical for bringing down the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are driving climate change. So it was already a crisis before COVID. As your paper points out, what COVID is doing, unfortunately, is it's making the already rampant illegal trade in wildlife from the seas and the forests easier to get away with as enforcement is cut back or redirected to other purposes. It's also putting more pressure on rural areas as people are in fact embarking on reverse migration, leaving urban areas, going back to their rural villages, moving more out into the natural ecosystems to sustain themselves. So COVID is pushing things in the wrong direction, unfortunately. What can USAID do? Well, your paper lays out a lot of great recommendations. I'm really excited about this opportunity actually because AID has a long and strong history with community-based natural resource management. So it's really a competitive advantage for the United States in terms of its foreign assistance program. And I know this because Gloria and I worked together years ago at USAID on these issues, and the agency has been a leader for decades. I would say a couple of things are very important. First is to focus on natural resource governance. As I said, COVID around the world, including here in the US, is leading enforcement budgets to be reallocated. We need to step up our ability to get the resources that frontline natural resource management officers need to do their jobs, to police against illegal and unregulated and underreported fishing, to police against illegal logging, illegal wildlife trade. We have very brave enforcement officers on the front lines, and they need the resources to be able to do their jobs. But it doesn't stop with government officials. Another AID strength is community-based natural resource management. So working even at the level of legal reforms to give communities more authority to manage and police their own resources. The communities who live with live from the harvesting of the seafood and sustainable harvesting of natural resources and agriculture are the best stewards. So putting more resources in their hands to manage their traditional territories is critically important. And lastly, I would highlight the opportunity to engage the private sector. So this is a bit of a plug for my own cause. The World Environment Center works with business to help them improve their performance on sustainability. And so I know firsthand that we have companies, great companies around the world who are eager to engage to help solve some of these environmental problems. So I think there's an opportunity for AID with its public-private partnership platforms to engage more companies in effectively managing natural resources. And I would say a couple of key opportunities there. Companies are increasingly focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and in fact reversing climate impacts by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So natural climate solutions, managing forests to store and absorb carbon, forests and agriculture and grasslands is a tremendous opportunity to engage companies from a variety of sectors, from technology to energy. Sustainable supply chains is a major focus for companies involved in anything that sources from nature, whether it's seafood or forest products or food. Increasingly interesting efforts to trace the management of those resources back to origin. So there are a lot of opportunities to engage companies there. And finally, something your paper points out, so-called ESG investing, environment, social, governance investing, is the fastest growing category of assets under management right now. So there's an opportunity for AID to help businesses in the region improve their performance and be able to demonstrate that they're scoring well on these ESG metrics to attract investment capital. So I guess to end on a positive note, there's a real opportunity here for AID to help the Indo-Pacific region build back better by investing in natural capital and moving away from some of the more destructive activities we've seen in the past.
Great. Gloria, do you have any questions for Glenn? This is really helpful, Glenn.
No, not yet, not right now. Maybe
Okay.
we should
Okay,
move on, Peter,
okay.
and then we'll.
Okay,
we'll
fine, great. So Peter, meeting the global demand for electricity and the internet will be, I think, one of the great challenges of the next 25 years. I think that COVID has made it very clear that demand for internet connectivity is going to track the demand for clean water and electricity all over the world, whether it's Southern Maryland or whether it's the Pacific Islands or whether it's Uzbekistan or whether it's Myanmar. In my view, is if the West does not provide this infrastructure and digital infrastructure to meet this unbelievably exploding demand, others are going to do so. You helped us with a bipartisan commission called the Higher Road that looked at digital hard infrastructure and digital infrastructure about a year ago on this issue. And then you helped us think through some of these issues in the context of the Asia region or the Indo-Pacific region with this session that we did. And we have a paper that'll be forthcoming later this month. So how can bilateral donors like Usaid assist Indo-Pacific countries in the areas of infrastructure and digital connectivity?
Well, Dan, thank you. And Gloria, also let me join my other panelists in thanking you guys for convening this panel and for doing the research you're doing on how USAID can really make a difference in the Indo-Pacific region. Dan, as you pointed out, if anything, COVID has really highlighted the importance of digital connectivity throughout the world. But I think we also have to take a look at the reality of the economic situation in the Indo-Pacific and actually globally. So if we look at the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the economies in the Indo-Pacific, we can see that most of them are struggling. And many of them will go into recession. And as a matter of fact, Australia is headed into its first recession for decades now as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the result of that for many of the countries where USAID is going to be focused is a tremendous debt burden that is becoming almost impossible to service. Now, there have been a number of initiatives around the world through the G20 and others to address some of the worst indebtedness. But even countries who go through that G20 process, but particularly those who do not qualify for the G20 process, are going to find themselves really strapped to manage the debt burdens they have. And that places an incredible strain on their ability to reinvest in core infrastructure and digital infrastructure. So this is one area where I think USAID and the US government, as well as our partners around the world, can really make a difference. And that is in helping these countries address at a macro level the sovereign debt challenges they have, the budgetary constraints that they have, by providing technical assistance with respect to not only debt negotiations, but also to budget management, public financial management in those countries, including addressing issues such as the tax base. Secondly, with respect to core infrastructure, many of the core infrastructure projects in these regions, and by that I mean things like roads, ports, and airports, railroads, and the like, are facing themselves significant financial challenges. And so the debts associated with those investments are often in trouble. And there's another place where I think USAID can make a difference by assisting the governments to conduct effective restructuring negotiations to assess the potential values and revenue streams associated with those investments and how to reposition those investments in this very stressed environment. Now, when you look beyond the kind of the debt challenges that these countries are facing, COVID-19 is also fundamentally reshaping many of the ways in which the economies in the region are going to operate. And I think it would be a little bit naive to think that once COVID-19 passes, that we will go back to the way things used to be. Mm. So I think what we're seeing are a couple of structural changes. One is a redirection of supply chains. As we've recognized through the COVID crisis, we've had over-reliance on certain countries, certain geographies for supply chains around the world. Companies and countries have recognized that, and there's an active process underway amongst both countries at national government levels and at the corporate level to really realign supply chains, diversify the base, et cetera. That means that countries in the Indo-Pacific region may in fact benefit as supply chains diversify away from China in particular to other countries in the region. So there may be an uptick in investment related to supply chain realignment in those countries, but there may also be a dilution if there is an over-reliance on a particular country for certain products or services. So we need to look at the supply chains carefully. And finally, to the point that you raised about digital demand, what we have seen is that in managing this crisis, digital tools have been absolutely essential. And many of the countries that are in the region are simply not well equipped yet with the digital technologies and infrastructure to address it, whether it's base broadband connectivity, network infrastructure, appropriate applications, et cetera. And this is a place where USAID can play a role as well, both in helping countries to understand what the digital requirements are likely to be in the future, and to helping them develop a plan and an investment profile that attracts a competitive range of corporations to provide digital infrastructure. In addition to that, there are measures that I think USAID could take that would really spur the innovation economies in these countries. And then we have to realize that many of the best innovations in the digital world are coming from emerging markets. And so if USAID can play a more catalytic role in both finding venture capital investment and bringing partner firms into these countries, I think we'll see an uptick in the ability of these countries to respond to that. It doesn't fundamentally address the question of, where's the money going to come from for, core infrastructure. But I think we begin that conversation by looking at, what the debt situation is in these countries, and then how do we mobilize, in some cases, concessionary finance or other tools that are available through USAID or other US government agencies or the ADB or others to bring capital and financing to these countries. But I think we've got to address some of these core structural issues.
Gloria, I'd be curious about your take on this, but Peter, let me just say one thing. I was interviewing the former governor of a very large province in Argentina yesterday for a podcast, and we were talking about this digital connectivity. She said, this is the new electricity. Do you agree with that?
I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, this is a moment, I think, in history where we're going to wonder, are we at kind of this digital divide inflection point? Those countries that are able to equip their citizenry, their infrastructure, their government services, their companies with digital tools, connectivity, and capabilities are going to continue to accelerate in the economic growth curve. Those countries that are unable to do so, I think, are going to find themselves falling further and further behind. So it is really an essential service we're talking about. The question is how to get it deployed and how to get it activated effectively. And there are, as we know, many, many risks associated with this, not least of which is cybersecurity, privacy protection, and other matters like that. But perhaps we'll leave that for a further question.
Dan, yes, I thank you very much. This is really quite helpful. There are so many problems that that COVID-19 exacerbated, and where do you begin? So we see small and medium enterprises, which account for maybe 90% of employment, to be going out of business. We see investments. Foreign direct investments going down significantly, and therefore the generation of more employment opportunities going down too. We see migrants coming back, and Glenn Prickett talked about domestically the reverse migration, people going back to the rural areas where poverty is higher relative to urban areas. And then we see government exacerbating through disinformation, through stronger authoritarianism, through more control of civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of the digital freedoms being curtailed. Where does an organization where do we start to begin to address all of this? When I was in the Philippines, when we did the Partnership for Growth, we did a constraints to growth analysis where you try to identify the binding constraints. When you are faced with all of them coming at the same time, where do you begin? So that you address the most basic ones. And then, the idea is that when you address the more foundational or fundamental issues, then others get addressed too. But where do we begin? As we develop our programs, where do we put our emphasis? Or does it matter?
Or is that a question to all of us, or?
Yes, and yes. Maybe you might want to start, because I started looking at growing poverty. The World Bank says that for the first time since 1998, we will see extreme poverty actually increasing. All the countries have been making a lot of progress. But it'll go back up, poverty will go back up, which would destroy the natural resources, because that's where they're back, people going back to the rural areas. The governments will try to control even more and probably promote disinformation about what is really going on. And then investments going down.
Gloria, I've got one thought for you. Big question where to start, but one thing that comes to the top of my list is proper infrastructure planning. So there has been significant needed investment in infrastructure. There will likely, going forward, be even greater need for investment in infrastructure in the region, not just the Indo-Pacific region, but all around the world. If the infrastructure is not built well from an environmental point of view, you'll see an increase in degradation of forests, shorelines, ocean habitat. And that's not only bad for the local population, that's going to exacerbate this risk of zoonotic disease transmission that got us into this pandemic in the first place. So there's a lot that USAID can do to leverage the investment that will come from other sources. The US absolutely should be investing in infrastructure, but China will, other parts of the world will be investing in the region's infrastructure. We have a great ability through our own domestic practice to do proper infrastructure planning to ensure that you can build valuable infrastructure without harming the natural environment that it's in and around. So, a relatively inexpensive program on AID's part to help the governments of the region design, site, build, operate that infrastructure effectively from an environmental management point of view would be incredibly valuable. And then another thing I wanted to, well, I'll stop there. I have one other point I'll make, but it's not so much on a priority list. It's a broader issue. So I'll let the others add their top picks.
Yeah, Glenn, I couldn't agree more. And let me pick up on that in a second, kind of go back to Gloria's point about kind of prioritization of activities. Because I think one of the things you've pointed out, one of the very important things that USAID can do. But in any kind of financial crisis, economic crisis such as this, there's the question of, okay, how do you, to overuse an analogy, how do you stop the bleeding? How do you address the immediate challenges that the government and the businesses and the population are facing? And then how do you re-stimulate activity in the economy, right? But in a more productive way going forward and launch those programs. And so I think that from a prioritization standpoint, from my perspective for USAID, you would want to focus, and I'm sure you are right now, on how you can help the countries to address kind of the immediate challenges they're facing. Everything from healthcare provision to immediate budgetary planning to immediate debt restructuring, these sorts of things that are happening now. Very practically speaking, to pick up on Glenn's point, there are a lot of challenged infrastructure projects in these countries as well, which need debt renegotiation or restructuring as well. So that's a very immediate activity. This is kind of, okay, how do we manage the crisis as it's unfolding right now from an infrastructure standpoint? Let's help to understand which projects are viable, which ones are not viable, which ones need to get restructured, and whether some of these fundamental economic changes that we've been talking about are really going to impact the ability to use this infrastructure in the future. And then secondly, as Glenn has pointed out as well, I don't think we can at all dismiss or discount the fact that China is very likely going to be the largest trading partner for many of these countries in the region. And China has a very well-known and publicized Belt and Road program. And it is developing and delivering infrastructure throughout the region. Now, that program has come under significant criticism. And I think one thing you can be sure about with the Chinese is that they are responsive to this kind of criticism. And I think what we're going to see in the Belt and Road program is a redesign of projects. I think we're going to find that they're more accountable than they have been in the past. But wow. USAID can play a very effective role in supporting the governments to understand what those investment programs look like, whether they are consistent with best environmental and social practices, whether they are in fact taking account of asset life cycle management, which means they are understanding what the total costs of operations of that infrastructure are. So because you can build a high quality project that costs more today, but costs you less over the lifetime of the project because the maintenance and operations of that project are much lower over the lifetime. It's a better built project, et cetera. USAID can play a very effective role in assisting the governments in the region to actually negotiate and deliver BRI projects, which the US or others might not be able to deliver. So I think that's also a very practical first step issue. But to the larger point, the small and medium-sized businesses are going to be reinvigorated when the demand increases for the supply chains to which they participate, and in which they participate when consumer demand resumes in those countries so that they can produce the consumer products as well. But I think kind of in the medium term, as you look at the restructuring in these economies, you have to think about what does a digitally enhanced economy look like? What kinds of small and medium-sized businesses are going to emerge? What does that do to changing the workforce as it exists? And what are the kind of the education requirements and the technical training requirements that are needed? So as you kind of move from crisis management to recovery, to be able to build into your plans ideas for equipping the country, the entrepreneurs, and the citizens with the skills and capabilities to serve a much more digitally enhanced economy.
I might just add one perspective, Gloria. Yeah, on the democracy and governance side, I think traditionally the democracy and governance community has kind of relied on the idea of freedom as what attracts people to democracy. You want the government out of your hair and not beating you over the head for saying what you think. In a pandemic, things are changing politically. What people in many countries want in a pandemic is the government to protect them and to feel secure. Of course you do. And the danger we're facing as a larger political community is in this moment that an authoritarian narrative says, well, naturally authoritarians we're more protected. Democracies are chaotic, they're disorganized. It's all about freedom, which isn't really that useful right now. So we have to be careful and have a counter narrative which says, no, actually, democracies are about accountability. And what you want now is a government that's accountable to you. And it shows that its performance, that it's taking some responsibility for what it's doing or not doing. And the way to do that is to have mechanisms of accountability, not just elections, but more fine-grained mechanisms of accountability through civil society and checks and balances and other things. And so USAID in the Indo-Pacific strategy has emphasized accountability, but now's the time to double down on that and say we don't just have a sort of wild-eyed democracy agenda. We have a very focused accountability agenda that really means something right now to people in the context. here are the kind of programs that we think deliver on that accountability agenda.
Then if I may follow up on that question, the problem is that, as you know, Tom, the accountability, the ability, the government is doubling down too in preventing the accountability to happen. For example, in the Philippines, Jerry Porta talked about the shutting down of the biggest TV station and, the arrest of Maria Ressa, who is probably the most vocal person in making the government accountable. We also just read that Cambodia is planning to control the internet service in the country in order to ensure quality. The accountability, COVID has also made it so that governments made themselves less accountable. You talked about the strength of civil society, and they are, but it's become a more difficult environment for them as well. And so what can we do without putting them in too much danger as we try to promote the accountability that you talk about?
Yeah, you're right. There's a stepping up of battles between governments and civil society you didn't mention as well. It's a bit further in the region is India just a day or two ago shutting down Amnesty International, which was entirely Indian organized. It was not a foreign NGO in the country, and a number of other Indian activist activities and people. And so throughout the region, you're right, governments are stepping up and trying to squeeze. They don't want criticism at this moment. They don't like the independent journalists who are, revealing their shortcomings. They don't like the critical voices and so forth. And so we have to rise to that moment and say, we're going to be there for the partners that we've had. And most of them are already taking it. They're already on the front lines. They're already, have made the decision that they want to fight this fight. And so we have to be there as much as we can with forms of support that are useful for them, as well as speaking directly to government counterparts and saying, yes, we're increasing our partnership with you, the government, because we want to help you in your emergency response. But intrinsic to our thinking about what this emergency response is recalibrating this balance between you and independent activists in your country to make sure it's one that is effective. So we've got to do it both in the policy conversations and in our assistance groups to show that we're willing to give the kind of flexible long-term support to these people and organizations who are able to hold people accountable.
Dan?
It just seems to me that one of the things I'm interested in is how we should each think about China. And I know, and we've talked about China in each of these in this conversation so far, but I'd like you all to think about how is China going to be operating. We've talked about that China as being a better, it has relatively good COVID. What I worry about is they're also, to the extent that it's going to be the largest trading partner, I worry about them either sort of going further on issues of democracy or taking advantage in the case of overfishing, or solving the issue of helping solve this issue of digital connectivity. I'd welcome sort of what your guess is of how you see China operating over the next year or two, because China's got a vote in the region, if I can describe it that way. Can I ask each of you just talk a little bit about that, how you see China over the next 12 to 24 months?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Who would you like to start, Dan?
Let me start with you, Tom.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, China has a number of ways in which it's benefiting from this crisis. And I think the way that it's going to continue to spread its political influence is two or threefold. First, stepping up partnerships with governments like Cambodia, where it already has strong partnerships, and saying we're a key partner right now. I don't see the United States helping you on the health emergency. Maybe they are, but we don't see it. Plus, what do they have to teach you? Look at how they're handling the situation. So they're going to try to step up their partnerships with governments. Also, Myanmar obviously will be another kind of place where they will do that, but also the Philippines and elsewhere. But then secondly, they'll be encouraging these kinds of executive aggrandizement actions that I described and saying, these civil society troublemakers, we've had problems with them too, but we've brought this under control and you should do the same. And so they'll be encouraging these kinds of actions. So Not that they're, nefarious always, or that they have an authoritarian agenda at every turn. They have largely an economic agenda, but it has authoritarian implications. And so we've got to be there. And for the United States, it's a challenge right now because, we haven't handled COVID well. So our narrative is not very strong. But we have to back up and say, wait, there's a broader narrative, which is when you look at the world, a lot of democracies have done very well, whether it's Germany or Taiwan or South Korea or Australia or Canada or many, many others. In general, democracies have done better than authoritarians, or at least as well. And so, yes, the United States is struggling for various reasons, but we're part of a community which has broader lessons for you. And we need to think about ways to encourage some of those other democracies to come into the picture with public diplomacy. Taiwan's been doing some. Taiwan is very active in its public diplomacy for reasons we know. But, South Koreans tend not to be, but this is their moment to step up a bit, as well as some other countries. So we need to be encouraging of that. And, we need to fight the battle both at the level of the policy discussions and the partnerships, and then also in, encouraging civil society, as I said, and not letting the Chinese get the better of the argument with respect to governmental controls. And then on the surveillance state, this is a moment for Chinese surveillance exportation of technology. The countries that are looking for new apps or other mechanisms to surveil people for COVID reasons. So we've got to be there and helping digital rights groups monitor what's going on and helping keep track of that situation, because a lot is happening relatively quickly on that front. So, so this is a moment for China, but so we've got to be clear-eyed about that and think about ways that we can, push back in a constructive, positive way that helps other countries.
Glenn, let me turn to you on this issue. China's got to vote.
Glenn, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Yeah, in addition to what Thomas already said, very well put, I guess I see a couple of additional trends from a natural resource point of view. So, and these aren't new, but I think we can assume in the next 12, 24 months, these will continue to accelerate. So China will continue to look to secure important sources of raw materials, whether it's minerals, agricultural commodities, timber, from countries in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond, by the way. It's not limited to Indo-Pacific, but for the purposes of today's call. So there'll be continued investment in infrastructure, not only to sort of secure political relationships, but to secure important raw materials. So that'll continue and likely accelerate. And then you'll have also the demand coming from China, which leads to increasing illegal and unregulated trade in fisheries and wildlife and timber. So that's again, as Tom said, that's not necessarily nefarious on the part of the government of China. It just is. It's a large population, so there's a lot of demand for these natural resources, and that's an incentive for illegal operators throughout the region. Some Chinese, but many not Chinese, but serving that market. So I think, as Peter said, the challenge will be to keep these issues in the spotlight, because the Chinese government does respond to, international pressure if it looks like it's going to be embarrassing for the country, as many countries do. So we need to continue to do the research. For example, your paper, Dan, is a good contribution to this. We need to continue to support organizations that are doing monitoring and research and reporting from across the region to make these trends, very clear to policymakers and to the public. And then we need to be engaging in dialogue with the Chinese government around their policies for trade in IUU fisheries, illegal wildlife, illegal timber. And that's something I wanted to highlight that you have in your paper, Dan, that I thought was so important. And that's that the US should restore natural resources management to a place of priority in its national security strategy. Prior administrations, Republican and Democrat, have put that into our national security strategy. It's not there now, and it needs to be again. AID, development assistance, critically important tool, but it's only one tool in the US government's arsenal. And, aid works when you have willing partners. We got to be clear-eyed and recognize that other governments across the region aren't always willing partners on all these issues. So we need to be able to apply diplomatic and security and trade pressure as well. And Here I wanted to highlight USTR. I serve on USTR's Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee. AID and USTR can work really well in tandem with other agencies when there are teeth in trade agreements that require governments to manage their resources sustainably. Then there's a demand for AID's programs. So, in terms of interagency work, just encouraging AID to stay plugged into what's happening in trade negotiations. The Kenya agreement is on the table right now. There are others that are going to be coming up. I wish we had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We worked hard to get really great environmental and natural resource provisions into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To be honest, this administration has used those templates as it's turned to more bilateral agreements, which is good. So there's a lot we can do with trade policy, and just in general, we need sticks as well as carrots in our arsenal of national measures.
I suspect, Glenn, that regardless of what happens next month, we're going to return to something that rhymes with the TPP just because of COVID. I think we're going to get a partial economic divorce from China. And you can't just copy paste a factory that's in Wuhan and put it into Indonesia, or copy paste a factory and put it into Central America. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into it, including things like trade agreements, rule of law, environmental regulations, infrastructure, power, electricity, water, mass transit, training. I could go on and on. A lot of that, underpinned by, in my mind, stuff that AID can do, but it also needs to work in tandem with other governments. I agree. So I think there's going to be larger political will. And I think all of our trade agreements have had a geostrategic or geoeconomic impetus. And I would argue that COVID is going to be sort of the mother of all geoeconomic and geostrategic impetuses for us to kind of return to the table on both plurilateral agreements and accelerating our trade agreements, because we're not going to want to be dependent on Chinese supply chains for anything anymore. We're going to want some resilient supply chains. We just did a report about supply chain resiliency. I just think it's going to be a huge opportunity for AID and for aid agencies, as of course there's going to be factories in China, but you're going to see folks build that marginal factory in Indonesia or that marginal factory in Central America. And there's a whole bunch of things that you've put on the table that are related to that. So I really appreciate you saying that. Can I just, Gloria, if I could just take advantage of Glenn having the floor for a moment, could we just spend a minute more on why is this managing forest and health issue? This is something Gloria put me onto and AID put me onto, which is like, why does that matter in the context of COVID? You and I both know why, and it's obvious, but could you just talk a little bit about this? Because I think not everyone of our television audience, if I can put it that way, or Zoom audience is going to understand why that matters.
Yeah, so COVID likely came from a virus in a bat in a cave in China, and we don't know yet how it got into people, but there was some zoonotic transmission of this virus from bats into people. And in fact, the majority of our infectious diseases now are zoonotic diseases. They originate in nature. And what's happening as more people are moving into formerly uninhabited natural ecosystems, you're getting more human wildlife contact, and you're going to see more of these viruses jumping from animals into people. So this won't be the last pandemic we face, unfortunately. And a smart way to approach this would be to get a better handle on how people are interacting in these natural systems. So, and again, this is a strong suit for AID. Your paper summarizes some of the great programs already in place at a regional level and in some of the countries like Philippines and others. So investing more in these programs that conserve natural areas, set aside conservation areas where you don't have human pressure, and then particularly important is going to be to manage the legal wildlife trade. So we could have a whole seminar on this, and you probably should, but there are a lot of competing recommendations on what to do. Some are saying shut down wildlife markets entirely. Others say, well, hold on a minute, a lot of poor people rely on those wildlife markets for their livelihood. So what we should do is better regulate them, have better monitoring and surveillance, and being able to shut down the high risk wet markets or wildlife markets. So that's an area that AID is going to have to step up.
I actually think, Gloria, Glenn, you're totally right. I'd love to do something on this wet markets issue. This is a hot button issue. People are vaguely aware of this so-called wet markets. I actually think there's probably an interesting exercise to be had among a variety of stakeholders on this, to have a responsible conversation, a decaf conversation. Let me just make one other comment, and then Gloria, I'd love to hear from you about it, just react to what's been said. But it seems to me, I think, let me just put a fine point, Glenn. COVID could look like a Sunday picnic in the park compared to whatever the next one of these funny named diseases is. Like, we're going to have another one of these because of urbanization, air travel, and changes in diet. And so as people move up the development scale, they want more protein from animals. So there's more animal husbandry, and there's more rubbing up against human beings to mainly forests. And so as a result of that, this natural resource management issue nexus with health is a real problem and a real issue. So when you first hear it, you're like, what? Why does this matter? This matters because this is one of the main drivers of pandemics is the so-called zoonotic transition, the transmission from animals to people, and it happens all the time. And the more interaction between peoples and animals there are through farming, and farming's good. I like eating meat. I like pork. I like chicken. But guess what? So does everybody else. And so as a result, it's going to happen. I like traveling on planes, and I like urban life, and so does everybody else. So as a result, this COVID thing, we're all sitting in our basements, could look like a Sunday in the park the next time and this has been horrible and challenging. We could have an even worse one the next time around. That's not a crazy statement, is it, Glenn?
No, not at all. And I just wanted to underscore another thing you have in your paper, and that's this movement around One Health, which is the idea of bringing together public health experts, natural resource management experts, governance experts. You know, just speaking from the environmental point of view, we work in our silos, our public health colleagues work in their silos. Gloria, I remember back when we worked together in the Policy Bureau, I literally sat next to Nils Dallaire. We were great friends. He was the public health advisor, I was the environment advisor. We did very little actual professional work together. And that's a problem, honestly. And so this One Health movement is trying to bring together the disciplines to figure out how we work together to manage situations like a zoonotic pandemic. And it's hard to do. It goes against the grain of both the public health discipline and the natural resource management discipline. So supporting programs like that would be very helpful if AID can get behind those sorts of efforts.
Right, and I would just say it should also include the people who work on democratic systems, because a lot of it is rooted in that. But then I wanted to hear Peter's response to your question about China, because that's where it is really founded on, you know. So Peter, 6 of the 8 countries that the CGD has indicated are in high debt distress are in Asia. And so what does the future look like? Where do you see China, the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, and what can we do?
Yeah, I think a couple of things here. One is that I think we need to recognize that China is, for most of these countries, the largest trading partner, and will likely remain the largest trading partner for decades to come. And I think that it's difficult for many of us in the U.S. and the West to kind of think about the shift, the economic shift that is associated with that. At the same time, at least at this point in time, the value and volume of U.S. foreign direct investment in these countries in Asia is much greater than the Chinese footprint. And we have long histories with many of these countries, mostly friendly histories with many of these countries. And as Tom has pointed out, kind of the soft power of democratic traditions and the aspirations for liberty for individuals. These are very powerful benefits that I think the U.S. brings and the Western world brings to the region. But we cannot ignore the economic fundamentals, I think, that are really shifting the dynamics in the region. So from my perspective, I think USAID should be looking at the region from the standpoint of how do we create greater, within these countries, how do we contribute to their ability to maintain a multiplicity of relationships, meaning balancing their relationship with China with a relationship with the United States and the West in such a way that they have a greater agency over their own decisions. Most of these countries do want to do business with China. It's very economically beneficial for them to do business with China. The infrastructure investments China is offering are in many cases more than what the West could be able to deliver, but they do not want to become, to use an overwrought term, vassal states, so to speak, of China. So they are very much interested, in my experience, in maintaining strong and close relationships with the United States. And that is not just political relationships, it's economic relationships as well. And so some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of, assisting these countries through the economic challenges they're currently facing, helping to evaluate current projects and map a plan for that country's digital evolution, as well as infrastructure evolution, and along with the idea of these changing supply chains, it's all very important. And USAID can play a critical role there. But I think we would be mistaken if we thought that China's rise is something that is a temporary phenomena, particularly in this region. I'm not sure that's a good news story you wanted to hear, but I think the good news story is that most of these countries do want to maintain strong and productive economic and political relationships with the U.S. and that is a place where USAID can play a key role.
I've got other questions, but Gloria, maybe you want to ask something.
I have so many questions, but I noticed that we have about 170 people watching or listening in, and there is one question in the question box, and I'm wondering if there's a way to entertain any questions.
Yeah, sure. One of the questions that we had, are countries, this was asked in the Zoom Q&A, are countries in the Indo-Pacific coordinating reopening at this point in the pandemic, particular respect to international commerce and travel for business, tourism, family ties, and how is this being managed? I'm not sure our panelists will have a view on this, but Gloria, do you have a sense of this from what you're seeing in terms of you talk to missions?
I'm sorry. I was looking for.
No. So countries in the Indo-Pacific in terms of reopening for commerce and travel. Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of how countries in the Asia Bureau are they, if I want to get on a plane and go do business in the Philippines today, do I have to do a quarantine? And can you just, I can go.
It is quite limited right now. The only country that has opened up to phase 3, which is freer travel, is Thailand. I have not seen any other countries where we work that has really been open. It has been quite restricted. And that has really affected tourism, which is a major source of income for the countries. One of the things I wanted to ask, if we don't have any more questions, is with tourism down, with migrants coming back, with SMEs, a lot of SMEs going out of business, supply chains broken, how do you and one of the things that we've tried to do even before COVID was diversification of the economic base in order to address the issue of poverty in the region. How do you do that in the current COVID situation?
So in other words, if you're not going to have remittances supporting folks and you're not having tourism, where are the jobs going to come from?
Right.
Peter, let me start with you.
I think it's a very serious concern. I think it's a very serious issue that is not going to be resolved instantly. I think we will obviously get a handle on the COVID pandemic, hopefully in the next 12 months or so. And then we will start to see a return to some of the more traditional sources of income. Tourism will return. We know there's pent-up demand for tourism amongst many people in the world, and we'll start to see.
Hell, I'm ready to go right now. I want to get to Taiwan.
That's right.
And I think we'll see also, migration returning in the sense of economic migration. And so we'll see an uptick in remittances as economies come back around the world. But that is, it's going to take months and maybe longer for that to come back. And as we talked about previously, some of the fundamental structures of the economies are going to change as a result of the pandemic as well. So, again, we have to look at, in my perspective, we have to look at this in two ways. One is what are the immediate things that we can do? And as we saw in the US and many other countries, that often involves fiscal stimulus, right? Injecting money into the economies so that consumers have money to spend, that businesses have work to do, et cetera, related to the kind of the domestic consumption issues. Many countries in the region don't have the fiscal space to do that. So here again is where linking USAID can help to link companies in the region with U.S. companies looking to diversify supply chains or diversify suppliers for different products and services, and to increase trade between the U.S. and those countries. It will stimulate a number of businesses, and obviously those businesses then rely on other businesses in that economy, and that helps to return things. But short of fiscal stimulus, which many countries don't have the ability to do, unless you can get, and there is some of this money available through the IMF and other sources, means by which you can inject fiscal stimulus into those economies. It's going to be very difficult times for a number more months. On the other hand, as well, infrastructure projects often tend to generate multiple jobs and great benefits, externalities in the environment, but they do take some time to wind up. So, building a large-scale infrastructure project, even if it is absolutely essential for the economy, still takes months, if not years of planning, including the requirements for social environmental analysis, and then it takes a number of years to deliver. So I think getting those plans underway now, as Glenn was pointing out, is another place where USAID can help. But there are limited tools available short of fiscal stimulus or direct food support and other things that I think can be done by USAID in the current environment. I don't mean to be so pessimistic, but that's kind of my perspective on it.
Well, Gloria, I've got a couple questions that have come up for you. I want to come back to the panels, but I think these are, I think, relevant to this conversation. One is that Mongolia is seen as a beacon of democracy in Central Asia. How does USAID see Mongolia now? Will Mongolia become a greater interest for USAID in the future? So that's a question for you, Gloria. Maybe Tom, you might comment on Mongolia, but Gloria, go ahead.
Yes, there was a time several years ago when we thought Mongolia had made it to the upper middle income country category. And so we started pulling back, but that is not the case. We are now reestablishing. We are reestablishing our presence there. We have a U.S. Foreign Service officer based there now. We are increasing our programming. We've never we've always stayed and continued to provide funding for young leaders. And so our work in democracy has always continued in Mongolia, and we are continuing to increase that. We are also accelerating our work in economic diversification, actually. They have, one of the reasons that they lost what they had was because of not being diversified. And so we're working with them on that, working with small and medium enterprises, making them more have access to capital. Once upon a time, we were supporting a microfinance program there, and that program has actually led to the establishment, the creation of one of the biggest development banks. And so one of our success stories. And when I've talked to the bank, the CEO of the bank, they said they have money, but they have no bankable enterprises. And so that's what we're trying to do in Mongolia. So yes, we are going back to Mongolia. We are accelerating our programming, still focused very much on democracy, taking advantage of working with young leaders, and then the economic area. We are thinking of working in the energy sector as well in Mongolia.
Tom, do you want to comment on the issue of Mongolia?
I do, just briefly. Caught between Russia and China, one might think that Mongolia would keep its head down politically. But it's interesting, Mongolia is proud of the democratic achievements it has. It's not perfect, but it's a kind of famous article in the Journal of Democracy a long time ago called Democracy Without Preconditions, about countries that totally surprise people that have become fairly democratic, even though they didn't have any of the preconditions that we tend to think of for democracy, and Mongolia was the featured country. But what I wanted to say was that Mongolia is putting itself forward diplomatically as a sort of trying to stand up for democracy. The Swedish government has recently, just last week at the UN General Assembly, launched a kind of informal alliance of democracies, and they looked for a partner in Asia, and Mongolia was the country that signed up first to be Sweden's partner in that alliance. And it was an indication that Mongolia is very keen to position itself internationally in democratic terms, not as a sort of keeping its head down politically. So that's worth noting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gloria, just another question for you from the audience. Nepal is at the crossroads of the Indo-Pacific strategy and Belt and Road initiatives. What is Usaid's plan so that Nepal does not fully fall on China's lap? I'm not sure if you cover, I suspect you cover, Nepal's in your remit.
Sure.
Talk
Yes,
about
yes,
Nepal.
it is. Nepal is one of our biggest programs in South Asia, in fact, and we are working very closely with Nepal in getting their federalism programming, their federalism law implemented so that they could democratize at the local level rather than continuing at the national level. We are providing them with, we're working with them very closely in the economic area as well. We are still working with them in getting them recovered from the earthquake that devastated that country several years ago. And so we are involved in almost all sectors there, from humanitarian, getting over the earthquake, to economic, to environment, and to democracy and governance. It is one of the countries that we put a lot of resources in South Asia, actually. It is a very big program for us. And that is one of the countries that we are currently putting together a program post-COVID. And one of the reasons that I'm trying to get us going in thinking about ideas, what do we do in a country like Nepal?
Glenn, let me turn to you, and then I want to come. There's a question from Gerardo Porta from the Usaid mission in the Philippines. I want to come back to the democracy, rights, and governance question. But Glenn, could you talk a little bit more about why is the fisheries issue getting so much attention globally, and why is it rising on the global agenda? And where, AID, in my mind, AID has a number of ways it could really help. And you've made some comments about them earlier, and we talked about it in the paper. But talk about, why does this matter? Why is the global fisheries matter, and why is it mattering now? And talk a little bit about what we should be doing to confront this.
Sure. Yeah. Let me. I'll respond on fisheries, and then I wanted to also come back to your question about what do we do with no tourism coming in, because that's a critical problem for resources.
Yeah, because they'll cut down all the forests or something, right? One of the reasons they keep natural resources is for tourism.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So why don't I actually? I'll start with that. I can't leave cut down all the forests on the table and not respond as a
Yes, I know. Sorry, that's to catalyze a conversation. As a conversation starter.
No, I mean it's a serious problem. As Peter said, I mean I can think of so many great AID projects I visited around the world where the whole idea is to sort of bring in tourists to visit the ocean, to visit the wildlife, to visit the forest as a sort of an alternative to either straight poverty or a more destructive activity. And all of those are going to be at risk now. And there is going to be pent-up demand, hopefully, to go back to dive tourism and wildlife tourism, but it'll be slow getting started. So what to do when people need to eat and they need jobs? And I don't have a great answer, but I do want to go back to a point I made earlier, which is there is tremendous interest now in the private sector in the United States, in Europe, even in Asia, Latin America, for so-called natural climate solutions. So about 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the way we manage land, deforestation, agricultural practices, grazing, et cetera. And about the same amount, in fact more, about a third of the reductions we need to make over the coming decades, we can get through relatively inexpensive improvements in the way we manage land and natural resources. So businesses are very alert to this. Companies ranging from BP to Microsoft are making big commitments to invest in restoring forests and wetlands and grasslands for their carbon value. So that's something AID should be paying close attention to. Your projects are tremendous platforms to bring in that kind of private sector investment. And then, as Peter said, a classical response to this will be government stimulus spending. So to the extent that AID has the ability, or you can leverage other investors to make infrastructure investments in the region, there's a lot of science now pointing to the benefits of so-called natural infrastructure or green infrastructure. So for example, a healthy coral reef can remove 90% of the energy in storm surge. So by protecting and restoring coral reefs, it essentially forms as a living shoreline natural infrastructure to protect the buildings, the economic assets that sit behind that reef. And there's a whole lot of great science around that for reefs, wetlands, forests, and the role they can play in mitigating flooding, storm surge, providing fresh water on a reliable basis. AID, for example, is funding a green infrastructure project in South Africa, has been for a long time, that puts people to work removing invasive species and restoring natural habitats to provide more fresh water for the cities of South Africa. So there's a lot of green infrastructure investment opportunity that AID and private sector partners could invest in a lot of these rural areas that are going to be suffering now because the nature tourism is going away. Fisheries, I have to say right up front, I am not a fisheries expert, but thankfully it is getting a lot of attention. The world's fisheries are not in good shape. The majority of our fisheries are overfished, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. You have a lot of illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing that is driving these fisheries populations into even greater risk. And this was a problem before the pandemic, and as I indicated, you're going to see more of this illegal activity because enforcement budgets are going to be redirected, and people won't be paying as close attention to what's happening out on the high seas. This is where trade policy really matters, and thankfully, because of some strong direction from Congress on a bipartisan basis, USTR has been pushing very hard to have so-called port state measures incorporated in all of our trade agreements, which require governments to better manage these illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries. It requires a real push from the US, and then it requires resources to build the capacity of their customs agents and their fisheries management agencies to be able to catch and crack down on this illegal activity. So I guess the short answer is fisheries are in trouble. Even well-managed fisheries need better management, but the real problem in the region is this illegal, unregulated, and underreported fishing.
Hey, Dan and Gloria, could I just build off of something that Glenn said? I think Glenn raises a really excellent point on the issue of infrastructure. And if we look at kind of immediate or near-term measures that USAID might be able to enable, many of the technologies that are coming out now around sensors have tremendous capability to improve efficiencies of water management, for example, of public transit systems, and other kind of core infrastructure assets. And those technologies, by improving efficiencies, really help the green agenda and the environmental agenda. And the cost of implementing these technologies is not that high. So here's an area where USAID might be able to to play a role in evaluating these technologies and how they might be deployed in these different countries to improve the efficiency of public services, like the ones that I've mentioned. Secondly, some renewable infrastructure projects, such as solar and wind power, do not require as much upfront, time in planning and preparation as, let's say, a road project, right, or building a port or an airport or the like, and deploying more solar power generation or wind power generation could be a way in which to one, address the environmental needs and requirements in these countries, and also to stimulate economic activity.
Yeah, in fact, Dan, before you go to Jerry's question, in fact, renewable energies is a major part of the Indo-Pacific, the energy part of the Indo-Pacific strategy. It is an area where we can manage the environment better, but it also is an area where American businesses have, through innovations, have an advantage. Just very, very quickly, one of the issues that we face in the general infrastructure area is corruption. And when we do talk about creating employment, when China funds this infrastructure, China brings its own labor. And so it does not really create much employment opportunities when they do fund under the Belt and Road Initiative. So to your statement earlier, Peter, about employment generating impact. One of the things that we're doing is trying to work with countries so that they can diversify sources of funding for their infrastructure and not depend solely on China, because it does not help when they go to China. They do not generate employment possibilities locally. So then back to you and Jerry's question.
So this is primarily for Tom. So Jerry Portas with the Philippines mission. There's a thin line separating government protection of the people from COVID-19 and the suppression of rights and civil liberties. Where that line is drawn is still the subject for vigorous and polarized debate in the Philippines, at least, where we are experiencing the longest and perhaps one of the most restrictive lockdowns in the world. Moreover, the line is not static. It moves from day to day, depending on the peaks and valleys of the pandemic. How do we position ourselves as how does AID position itself as an agency that supports the promotion and protection of rights in this context? Tom, let me start with you.
Well, that's an excellent question, Jerry. Thank you for that. It's absolutely correct to point out this thin line, because we don't want to be in the business of telling other governments they can or shouldn't do a lockdown, because first of all, we've had some trouble with it ourselves. This isn't a science yet. We wish it were, but different countries have had different experiences with lockdowns. So we certainly can give some advice, but we don't, that's a judgment call. On the other hand, we do want to make clear that we have clear in our minds that a lockdown is not the same as a restriction on democracy. What is a restriction on democracy is when a government uses the excuse of a lockdown to suspend parliament or ignore parliament, to undercut the courts, to delay elections without really thinking through whether it's possible to hold the elections, to persecute critics and to target journalists and independent activists who want to question elements of the public health response, and to suppress public information about what's happening with the lockdown. So it isn't whether or not there's a lockdown, it's whether or not the lockdown is used to carry out other measures which are restrictive of democracy and are not necessary. Some countries have had very effective lockdowns. Spain had an extraordinarily harsh lockdown in which it was illegal to go outside for 2 weeks. You could not set foot out your door. There were Spanish military representatives in the neighborhoods of Madrid making sure you didn't go outside, or you had to get a permit to go to the grocery store once a week for half an hour. But it was done in a democratic fashion. They didn't suspend parliament, they didn't undercut the courts, they didn't target critics, etc. And so Spanish democracy was not hurt by this lockdown. It was difficult for the society, but not difficult in a deeper political sense. That's the distinction we have to emphasize.
Gloria, I'm coming to the end of our time today. I see, I'm wondering if we might just maybe take one more, which is on what are the strategies that, this is from Laurel Bradley, what are the strategies that governments and civil society can use to ensure inclusive and equitable COVID-19 response and recovery efforts that USAID can support? What investments can USAID support in the region to prevent inequality gaps from widening, such as the digital divide, unequal access to protected rights, fragility of incomes that depend on informal labor markets, or growing limited participation in decision-making on natural resource management? That's a great and really interesting set of questions. Panelists, do you want to just take pieces of this? Peter, why don't I start with you, and then Glenn, and then Tom?
I think I'd like to defer to Glenn or Tom first. I'd like to hear the setting that they would.
Glenn, let me go to you.
Okay. Just, I don't know if this is a thorough answer to a very good question, but one thing that strikes me is that, AID has put some really good rural natural resource management projects in place. And so you've got some vehicles already that you can use to deploy resources, and you have good templates where you can stand up those sorts of programs in other countries in the region. So as we do see this reverse migration from cities to rural areas, I would say, investing in those rural natural resource management programs that you have and standing up new ones is an important place to start. And you don't have to invent a whole new approach to development assistance. You've got good platforms and templates to work from. So that's, I guess that would be my first answer, is kind of look to, fill up the budgets of programs that, may have been cut, or, may be on life support in some cases.
Tom?
Yeah, I would say one way to think about it, Dan, is that COVID is a governance X-ray, which allows you to see things in your own society more clearly than before. And above all, it's an inclusion X-ray. The differential effects of COVID on different populations within a country are mostly about inclusion and inequality. And so health system inclusion, labor rights, and sort of labor markets and how they work, and then educational effects and differential effects in different educational sectors and within different populations. For example, building back better, greater resilience really means greater inclusiveness. If we want a health system that's better next time, it isn't just about supply chains and giving it some flexibility and better, supplies and such. It's also about inclusiveness and responsiveness. And so in a way, building back better really means building back more inclusively. And this is a moment to say that there's a new reform debate. I'm hoping it's true in the United States too. I'm hoping we finally take a better look at our health system and say, why was it that Blacks and Latinos have a mortality rate of X times higher than white people in this pandemic? Our health system needs to take account of that and be more responsive. Seems obvious to me. Our labor rights, does it make sense for people not to have no paid sick leave when they're frontline workers and are working when they're sick because they're afraid of losing their income? Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. Building back better, building back more inclusively. And so inclusion often sort of has a political character. People are like, oh, it's a left-right thing. It isn't really. It's a resilience issue. An inclusive society is more responsive, more fair, but above all, more resilient to these kind of shocks.
Thanks. I think that those two comments really set the stage for this. And if we think about what Glenn and Tom have said about inclusion, about environmental rights and protection, social benefits, if we look at, for example, the health sector and say, okay, what is it that has made a difference in the health sector in many countries? It is the digital environment and the ability to move, to analyze, test, and to respond to this pandemic. And so, to the extent that we can improve those systems and practices, bearing in mind what Tom has said about the challenges with respect to civil rights and civil liberties, right? So there are ways in which you can deploy technology that enable a much greater testing regime, a much greater connectivity, telemedicine, and the like, including looking at contact tracing and other types of measures, without necessarily inhibiting civil liberties or creating a surveillance state infrastructure. And I think that is part of the, the challenge and the debate that many of these countries are having, because there are technologies available. Those technologies do allow you to deploy surveillance-like infrastructure. And so you need to be careful, and you need to have a good grounding in civil society to be able to address that. The same thing in terms of technologies with education. I mean, the education systems in many countries have been deeply crippled by COVID. And the fact that many of these countries don't have the bandwidth and the network capacity to deliver educational benefits when they can't reconvene classrooms is kind of a second and very deep blow to the ability for those countries to educate their citizenry and to be able to move into the digital age. So we've got to look at what are the technologies, low cost connectivity technologies that will enable new types of educational services and solutions for people, not just in urban environments, but in the rural environments as well. So I think these are a couple of the places where again, technology and USAID objectives intersect with the needs and demands of the countries.
Thanks, everybody. I'm so grateful, Gloria, to you, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your collaboration. Watch this space. We've got a series of papers coming out. Gloria, there's a whole series of issues that I think I'm going to come back to you about, because there's a whole series of pressing issues for AID and for the country that are related to the Indo-Pacific strategy that have come out of this. We want to continue to help AID and help the United States grapple with these challenges. And I know we can if we have thoughtful partners like
Absolutely.
Glenn and Tom and Peter. It really helped us think these issues through. Thank you, Gloria, for your partnership. Thank you, AID, for your partnership.
Thank you very, very much. I really can't thank you enough. Sorry. And I thank everyone who's tuned in. This has really been very helpful to us, Dan. Thank you for pulling together such bright minds, Tom, Peter, Glenn, and others that you put together. Like I said, this isn't just going to be a paper exercise for us. This is for real. And we will use our learnings from here to inform the country strategies that we are in the process of putting together. So thank you very much. And good night, Tom. I know you're in Europe somewhere. So
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So everybody stay safe.
Yeah.
Bye.
bye-bye.
Bye now.